Ivo. Thank you for taking part in our interview series, China Strategy. Welcome to talking to us. I'm really looking forward to your answers and to your ideas about the broad topic of China in general. Ivo Ganchev, you have been working with China since 2012. You're based in Beijing and London, and you also wear quite a lot of multiple hats: academic, executive, consultant. So you have a lot of knowledge from different angles that will be very interesting for us today. Because as an academic, you told me you research international affairs and Chinese foreign policy, and you also teach at a number of institutions, including Queen Mary University of London and Beijing Union University. As a consultant, you worked with private companies in trade, investment, tech, and education, and you're currently an associate partner at Trade Bridge Group, right? And last but not least, as an executive, you are currently the vice chairman of the Bulgaria-China Chamber of Commerce. So you have very different views and angles from which to see the relations between the European Union and China. And we'll talk about China and the world from this variety of perspectives that you have. Welcome here, Ivo.
Thanks very much, Amy. Thanks for the invitation. I think this is a great platform, and congratulations on running it. I hope that it will be really useful to our listeners.
Yes, I'm quite sure about that because our questions are super interesting. So please, let's just start. Let us know, what is your current position? I mean, we've heard a little bit about it, but maybe you can say, what is your interest in EU, UK, China relations? What are you doing currently? What is your perspective?
Sure. So you already mentioned the three hats that I wear. I'll start with my academic work. My published research focuses on international politics and China's relations with the developing world. So that's slightly different from my corporate world, from my corporate work. In my research, I tend to employ theoretical perspectives to analyze Chinese foreign policy and Chinese strategy more broadly. Now, in my corporate work, I tend to focus a lot more on the relationships between the developed world and developed regions. So this is why at Trade Bridge Group, I work on China, EU, and UK markets. So in terms of my interest in this area, it comes mostly from a business/commercial perspective. And then as a consultant, I work on a variety of projects depending on what the needs of certain companies are. The projects have been very diverse. Some of them have been in education, which is a huge market in China. Some of them have been in tech and new blockchain technology as well. And then again, some of them have been more traditional trade-related projects. And finally, my most recent executive position at the Bulgaria-China Chamber of Commerce relates to representing the interests of Bulgarian companies here and coordinating their engagement with China in terms of, for instance, participating in expos, explaining their concerns to departments of the Chinese government when we can and when we have the opportunity, in feeding the information back into the loop. So my work is focused roughly in these fields.
Okay. Incredible. One person on so many different focuses. So let's start with the first one, maybe a little bit more about your academic research. You're currently a lecturer at the Queen Mary University of London and an adjunct professor of global leadership at Beijing Union Universities. So what is the focus of your academic work? Especially global leadership sounds really interesting and very, very like up to date at the moment.
Sure, yeah. Well, I hope that my students think that way as well. The global leadership module is something that I teach at Beijing Union University. It's a class that combines insights mostly from politics, philosophy, and economics into one course. And this is a one-semester module that I usually teach to students that are interested in international trade and international relations there. Up to 30 students can sign, so sometimes I get students from different majors. And this is slightly different from what I do at Queen Mary, because at Queen Mary, I teach on modules that already exist, partly because of time constraints. And there I've taught a variety of students. Sometimes I've taught them more generic courses such as academic writing, and I've been able to supervise a very wide array of Chinese students that sometimes work on researching law, sometimes work on researching finance. So that's been an interesting experience from a practical standpoint to see how this young generation of Chinese people in the West think about different issues. This work has been mostly related to my teaching. Now, in terms of my published research and the academic conferences where I speak, things get a lot more specialized. As I mentioned before, my work on China and the developing world mostly has had to do with China-Africa and China-Latin America relations, which relates also to the Belt and Road Initiative that we might later talk about as well. And also in terms of theoretical work in academia, I tend to think about theories of integration because I believe that's one of the great trends of our time, regardless of whether we look at Asia or Europe or developing regions.
Okay, that's super interesting. We will talk about the Belt and Road Initiative later on, so maybe you can give us some hints, or also if you have something published recently, I'm very glad to share the link in the bio so we can all like read up on your work. Let's move to your next hat as an associate partner at Trade Bridge Group, which also deals with the China and developing world topic. There you're dealing with trade, investment, technology, international affairs, and many other things. What are the most important trends from this perspective, and what are the most important developments that you get from this angle?
Sure. Well, my work at Tradesbridge Group is mostly focused on a corporate perspective and on getting business deals done. So I focus on the UK, the EU, and the China market. And when we look at this triangle, we can see some very specific trends there. So for instance, when we speak about China and UK engagement, this is really focused, and I'm talking about intensive engagement, is focused in a few sectors. The first one is clearly education, with the high quality and the global branding of British education. It attracts a lot of Chinese students every year, and also a number of UK universities have campuses now in China, including Nottingham, Ningbo, for instance, Xi'an Liverpool University as well. And this relates to tourism on one hand, because a lot of these students get to travel and their families come to visit them. And then also it relates to property as well, because well, I would say a considerable portion of the property deals that I've worked on are related to students who come to study in the UK, and then their parents decide to buy a flat for them instead of paying rent. And then from then on, they get more interested into investing in UK property as well. So these areas, education, tourism, and property, are kind of interrelated. And then the other two areas where we see substantial engagement between China and the UK from a business perspective are healthcare and technology. Interestingly, the healthcare engagement between China and the UK predates COVID. So we saw a number of years before COVID, 2014, 15, 16, an increase in a demand for instance, medical equipment from the UK that was very high quality. Later in 2018, 19, I worked on a project that had to do with a Cambridge-based company and training Chinese doctors. So that was another interesting angle into healthcare as well. And then finally, technology. Chinese companies are increasingly interested in the latest and greatest technology, both in terms of innovating at home and in terms of what's happening abroad. So naturally, that attracts a lot of attention as well. So that's in terms of China and the UK. When we look at China and the EU, it gets a lot more diverse because the EU is so much larger than the UK. and a lot more complex. The trade numbers there are very high, so they're some of the most important trading partners for each other in terms of volume. And then there's more diversified investment, albeit a little bit stagnant, and that started also pre-COVID. So that has to do with the comprehensive agreement on investment that has recently been in the news cycle as well.
Mhm.
Now, there's a lot more dependency, in my view, between China and the EU compared to China and the UK, just because the numbers are so much larger, because of the trade relationship, and because of the potential of the Chinese market for European companies, for the large German companies, for the large French, for instance, wine producers, etc.
Yeah.
Now, the volume of Chinese investments into the EU is not necessarily distributed as equally as for me, for instance, I would like. Because a lot of it goes to the western part of Europe and to countries that have much better branding. So if you look at, for instance, where the money goes, perhaps around 10% of it or so goes into the eastern part of Europe and the more quote unquote marginal areas from an economic standpoint. And most of it is directed towards the countries that offer high tech and good branding.
Yeah.
So that's that also tells us that the relationship between China and the EU has to do with the larger EU states' interest. Now, you mentioned also, apart from the three geographical regions, China, the UK, and the EU, the sectors that I work on, including trade, tech, international politics, education, and culture. So I'll just say a few words about each of them and some of the recent trends that I've observed in them. So starting with trade, perhaps two of the most significant things that I would watch out for are number one, the integration of technology and trade. Just because all of these new systems in terms of automation, in terms of robotics and technology, they tend to increase the speed of trade significantly when it comes to things like e-commerce, like deliveries, like optimizing the deliveries of even international orders. And we see that in terms of, for instance, international orders, we now have the technology to coordinate the deliveries faster than they get processed sometimes at customs, depending again on which country you're talking about. But this is a very interesting and big development. And the other trend that I would look out for here is the land-based trade routes. So we've had the vast majority of world trade reliant on sea shipments for a very, very long time. And recently, with the improvements in infrastructure technology globally and the large capacity of China to build new infrastructure, both domestically and globally, I am very bullish on seeing the development of new routes, much like the EU-China freight train, for instance. And I believe that this will also happen when it comes to other regions, developing regions, where we see new roads going through mountains that before had to be sort of circumvented to get a delivery done, for instance. So that's a big trend that I would watch for in terms of trade. When it comes to tech itself, the development of technology and speed is self-evident. In terms of Chinese innovation there, I'm a strong believer that China will get to innovate in virtually every major sector. This is a very vibrant economy, and it's moving past the phase that relies primarily on just industrial capacity and manufacturing. And there are a lot of people here that are highly motivated, that have been abroad, have come back, have brought know-how with them. and that are willing to work very hard on innovation. So I'm a strong believer that we'll see in the future Chinese innovation in virtually every major aspect of tech, and we've seen it already in some of them. For example, like the electric vehicle market. China has at the moment, I think the last report that I read was 119 manufacturers of electric vehicles that are operating and selling on the market. This is incredible. This was something that did not even exist in its current form a number of years ago. It develops very fast, and they do it efficiently. I drive an electric car myself in Beijing right now, and some of these cars, in terms of the value that they offer, in terms of the price and sort of the relative reliability of the car for this price that it's offered, is incredible. You could easily buy a new car here for maybe 70,000, 80,000 renminbi, and I mean an SUV that you can use as a family car, and that's about 10,000 euros. That would have all of the features that you have in a regular new car anywhere around the world, and it would be reliable. And sure, its battery is not going to last as long as a Tesla one, but given the price difference, I think it's something that a lot of people would take any day of the week. So tech is something where China is growing increasingly strong. Now, in terms of tech, we've recently, of course, heard a lot of media coverage that has to do with the interaction between tech and politics and international relations, and an increasingly polarized rhetoric there. So when I look at the international system today, I think that it's valuable to think about it from a broader perspective, not just from the perspective of this year or the next couple of years, because what we've seen in the past 15 years or so, I believe, is a shift from a unipolar US-dominated system towards a role-based model of international relations. So I'll explain what I mean. When you talk to, for instance, academics or sort of policy professionals about the international system, usually the terms that come to mind have to do with unipolarity, bipolarity, anarchy, which means essentially everyone for himself, not as in chaos, or hierarchy, where you have states dominating the system. At the moment, we, I believe, are at a stage where a number of great powers are taking on different roles that are mutually complementary. So the US is clearly a dominant player in terms of security. And I mean, at the very least, we have Europe entirely relying on the US for security. So this is something that's very difficult to change. And we saw that with sort of Trump's ultimate downfall, the population of the US did not choose a government that would shrink this security capacity considerably at the end of the day. And then at the same time, you have the EU, which is essentially almost down to zero in terms of security capacity. It has a respectable economic power, but nothing that would drive the entire world economy. But it's very strong in terms of soft power when it comes to laws, regulations, when it comes to the perception of European quality, reliability. This is where the EU leads. And a lot of developing countries are looking up to the EU and learning from its models of institutions. They're not looking at US institutions, they're looking at European institutions and at the legal system as well. And then in terms of economic drive, I don't think there's anybody that could reasonably claim to push economic growth as quickly and on a scale as large as China. Maybe apart from 30 years down the line, maybe India, if they develop as people predict. But China is becoming this economic engine of the world economy. And then at the same time, you have other powers like Russia and Turkey becoming regional actors, Brazil, for instance, but then they don't necessarily factor into the game of big power politics as much anymore in the case of Russia, or they haven't risen up to the stage in the case of Brazil. So this is the international system that we're in. And given this role theory model, I'm skeptical that it will break down as much as some of the critics predict, or that we're going to see new quote unquote Berlin walls in the world, because these three big actors, China, the EU, and the US, are playing mutually complementary roles. There might be temporary increases in rhetoric, but given their role in the international system, I don't think that this will break down as fast or as sort of to the extent that people might expect or predict. And finally, I think that there is also education and culture that I both work on and I tend to think about quite a lot. And we've seen, first of all, Chinese education expand over decades. This is an incredible market here. It's valued at over 300 billion, if my number is correct, but it's certainly in the hundreds of billions. All of these numbers are estimations just because of the incredibly large number of small education companies that are popping like mushrooms everywhere in China. This is a sector that is driving, to some extent, China's development and growth, because a lot of the people that are moving to the cities, part of this big urbanization trend, it's some of them are first generation university graduates. These kids are curious. They are open to learning about the world. And at the same time, they are also learning that the China model works for China. And they are, to a considerable extent, agreeing to a lot of the values that are instilled in the Chinese education system. And when I say this, I don't mean it in a critical way in terms of them just not thinking about things enough. I mean that from their perspective, they see a country that is developing more quickly than the rest of the world. So if I were them, I would also reasonably believe that the values that are instilled in this country, in this system, have considerable merit in them. So from this perspective, Chinese education is something that is extremely important for understanding where the country is going. And it's also a sector that in the private aspects of education, in terms of after-class activities, English language centers, other training companies, is very much marketized in China. In terms of sort of the fees that the students pay, you can find anything from dirt cheap, a few dozen kuai per hours, to the best of the best sort of international experts being flown in to teach teenagers just because they get paid incredible amounts of money to do it. So this is a very diverse market, and it's something that will inevitably remain crucial, and it will have a great impact on the world, in my opinion, as well, both as China integrates its education system with the global one and invites world-class expertise and integrates it into the system of its young and up-and-coming generation, and in terms of the way that this impacts the rest of the world, because some of these young graduates that go through the system will be the next business leaders, the next leaders of China, and this is something that, in my view, is very important to understand and examine very closely.
Wow, so that was a real broad range of trends. Thank you very much for that. Incredible. So I'm really impressed about your insights on such broad topics, and it's super interesting to see what the balances are and what the trends are between the European Union, UK, and China from these different perspectives. So thank you very much for that.